December 14th, it was another normal day in the life of Scarlett Lewis and her kids. Unfortunately, got the call, come to the school. There was a shooting.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, pass down wisdom, and bring the world closer together.
Can you describe your life before, I suppose, what one might call the inflection point of December 14th, 2012?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I was a single mom that was raising two young sons by myself. We lived on a little farm in the middle of Sandy Hook, Connecticut. It's how I chose to raise my boys. I wanted them to be outside, around animals, getting dirt under their fingernails, getting sunshine. It's how I like to live my life, very active. And then December 14th, it was another normal day in the life of Scarlett Lewis and her kids. And I, unfortunately got the call, come to the school. You need to be, there was a shooting. There's a place, we were meeting at the firehouse at the end of the cul-de-sac by the school. Come be reunited with your kid, pick them up and bring them home. And of course, I was never reunited with Jesse, as neither were 19 other first grade parents or the families of 6 educators, one of the worst mass shootings in U.S. history. And that was my inflection point. You're absolutely right. I realized that what had happened was preventable. And I was directed by a few things that my son had done. First of all, we found out that he had saved 9 of his first grade classmates' lives when the shooter had turned into his room after murdering his principal and guidance counselor right outside his first grade classroom door. He came into my son's room and his gun ran out of bullets. So during the short delay that it took for him to change his clip, Jesse directed 9 of his classmates to run, and he was credited with saving their lives. And then, we feel like he didn't run. He wanted to protect his teacher because he was killed right in front of his teacher. And then I came home to the farmhouse where I raised my kids. It took me a few days to actually come back to the farmhouse. I was really afraid to do that. I didn't want to see Jesse's boots by the door or his toothbrush by the sink. But I had to get clothes for him and to be for his casket. And I remember wanting them to be warm because it was really cold in December. So I came back to the house with a bunch of my family, and I found a message that he had written on our kitchen chalkboard shortly before he died. I didn't find it until after his murder, and he had written 3 words: nurturing, healing, love. They were phonetically spelled because he was in first grade and just learning how to write. But I knew that if the shooter, who was a former student of the Sandy Hook School District, in fact, he was just graduated, if he had been able to give and receive nurturing, healing love, the tragedy would never have happened. And I knew that I'd be spending the rest of my life spreading that message. And so here we are, 9 years later, and less than a month, and I'm still doing that.
Thank you for mustering the stamina to tell that story. I can't imagine that it gets too much easier to tell, though you tell it with great grace and eloquence. I am curious about what the process of grieving was for you. And, we're never really taught how to grieve. This is not something that exists within the general K through 12 curriculum or even in higher education. Yet it is inherent to everybody's life at some point. Now, obviously, your grief and your circumstances were so severe and particularly gruesome, losing a child. Like my grandfather lost his daughter, Terry, in an accident. And I saw the disorder that caused for him throughout his life. But everyone does confront grief at some point in their life. And I wonder, could you give us a window into what that process was like for you? Because I think it can be really instructive for other people that are going through moments of suffering, and you seem to be able to manage it again with such grace.
I've learned a lot about grief because you're right. Nobody talks about it. I've learned that there's a tremendous amount of fear around grief. And grief is a natural part of life. We don't just grieve the significant losses in our lives, but we grieve sometimes every day. We grieve the loss of, we're all grieving right now through COVID, the loss of the life that we wanted or we should have, or freedoms. I mean, there's so many ways that we grieve, and it is a natural process. We shouldn't be afraid of it. It's actually a process of self-awareness and growth. But I was very careful with myself. I was very gentle with very few expectations. And I really protected myself during my grieving process. There was a lot involved. There was, FBI that was involved from day one in an investigation into how something like that could happen. And in fact, that investigation went on for 5 years before that report was released. And the families had regular meetings with the FBI. And as you can imagine, gruesome details came out in those meetings, and things that would make you very, very angry about things that were overlooked and not done, and injustices for really all involved. And I didn't go to a lot of those meetings. I had my mom go for me and just tell me what I needed to know, because I didn't want to overburden myself. I wanted my grieving process to just be natural. And I think that I had a lot of patience with myself, and I had absolutely no expectation, because I mean, what is the expectation when your child is brutally murdered in their first grade classroom? No one knows. And actually, one of the things that was a little off-putting to me was being in front of people who were there to help me and seeing the fear in their eyes, because they didn't know. And so I realized, wow, this is really going to be a journey that I'm going to have to take myself. And the good thing about the way that I did it was that I was open to opportunities to heal. And it's kind of interesting what I saw, and the difference between me and maybe some others that are on this same journey along with me. And one of the benefits of living in Sandy Hook was that people from all over the world came to offer their modalities of healing. And I was open to all of them. I thought that they wouldn't hurt me, worst case scenario, and best case scenario, they could help me. And I wanted to be helped. I did not want to stay in the dark place that I was. And I also had practiced being present before the tragedy. So with my boys, I was present in the moment with them. Thank goodness it was before the time of screens, but even so, we didn't have a TV because I didn't want to compete with a TV. I just wanted to be with them all the time. And I was a single mom, remember, and I worked full time and I had a long commute and I worked long hours. So the time that I was with them, I wanted to be present with them. So I had already had this practice with the boys. And so I extended that practice into my grieving process. I was present with myself and my pain. I didn't shy away from it. And I think because of that, it helped me move through it more quickly. I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't resisting it or avoiding it. In fact, I remember one moment where I was sitting on my mom's couch and I was going over the people that I had in my life known that had lost kids. And I was thinking about my aunt, my mom's sister, who had lost a young daughter from leukemia. And she had said that she didn't see color for years. I think it took her 4 or 5 years to get color back into her life. And I was experiencing the exact opposite of that. When I looked around, everything was more colorful. I was seeing colors I'd never seen before. And I was trying to figure out how that could possibly be. And I realized that I think I was addressing this in very presently, just very in the moment. And I was making a conscious decision to not do it with fear, to do it with love, and to see everything in my life through a lens of love. And that included everything, by the way. That included the shooter as well.
Wow, there's so much there. I want to pull on a couple of different threads. First, one thing that you said, that you were open to the opportunity to heal, which I think is a very meaningful statement. I've read a little bit of an author named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I know that you're very well read, so you may be familiar with her. She wrote brilliantly on the topic of grief. And she codified grief in 5 stages, but they were all characterized until the very end by a shutting down, a depression, an isolation, a closing off. Her stages were famously, see if I can recall them on the spot, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then eventually acceptance. And it appears to me that you, in some ways, bypassed some of those stages by being open. And that may have been a product of what you said, your ability for mindfulness or non-judgmental presence, sacred presence, however you want to talk about it or categorize it, but your ability to be aware in the present moment and to experience emotions and thoughts as phenomena arising, but not necessarily completely become those things and identify with those things. And I want to ask you if you had a mindfulness or meditation practice that you found useful, because, there's this trope in spiritual circles or wellness circles that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Mm-hmm. And
Mhm.
Anyone that's kind of spent any time in spiritual circles have probably come across that aphorism. And it sort of suggests that grief is a phantom of our own projection. And really what we need to do is just kind of let go and not identify with it. But it almost cheapens the process, because liberating yourself from that kind of grief is often hard wrought, difficult work. It doesn't just come, with the green juice or something. So I wonder, what were the practices that allowed you to be so open, and that allowed you to experience the world with love instead of anger?
It's interesting that when opportunities came to try new therapies, I would do that. And it includes tapping, by the way, because Nick Ortner, who's the president of the Tapping Solution, lived in Newtown. I didn't know that, but he literally came to my house and sat on my couch and tapped with myself and my father and my son, my older son. And it was an incredible experience. I felt relief. I had been angry, but not about the tragedy, which was kind of interesting. I was angry about something else that happened. And so I'm tapping with Nick through this, and he kind of broke through that and we both realized together that I was using that incident that I was angry at to protect my grief, for me not to look at my own pain. And so we blew that wide open, and it was incredible. It was an incredible experience. And so I started tapping with him, which was an incredible privilege. And I would start telling the other parents how incredible tapping was. And Nick had offered to do this series of tapping lessons for the parents, and no one wanted to do it. And the reason was because, I had said, look, I think that this is amazing. It's really helped me. It works. And their reaction was, well, what if it doesn't work for me? And so kind of like a more fearful response. So I think there's a lot to being open to healing, and the expectation of seeing it as an opportunity, and an opportunity for growth. One of the things that I've learned about since the tragedy is post-traumatic growth. We think through a lens of negative bias. So we focus on the negative. This is our brain's way of keeping us safe. And so everyone's heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. I had too. In fact, while I was waiting at the firehouse while they supposedly were looking for Jesse to be reunited, in my mind, of course, I was catastrophizing, going over worst case scenarios, which is what we do as human beings. It's our brain's way of trying to get us prepared. And I thought, oh my God, if this doesn't go well, if Jesse doesn't come back, I'm going to be experiencing PTSD, because that's all I knew. And then I thought, wow, how's that going to manifest in me? I'm probably going to be institutionalized. And then I started thinking, well, who's going to take care of my older son? And,
right.
And so, I think that, this concept of post-traumatic growth, which is now just the foundation of almost everything that I do, is the understanding that when we go through difficulty, it is an opportunity for growth. It is an expansion of who we are and what we know. And rather than closing ourselves off to keep ourselves safe. Really, there's safety in opening ourselves and allowing the experience to unfold in front of us. And, you know, one of the other reasons that I did that I was probably came upon that maybe quicker than other people was because I did have an older son. And he, you know, I knew that I was teaching him in the moment how to handle difficulty and roadblocks and challenges and even pain and suffering in his life. Everything that I did, it wasn't just words out of my mouth, but it was every reaction, every action that I had. He was watching. Facial expressions, gesticulation, energy, everything that I did was teaching him in the moment how to move forward from this. And I knew that it was up to me to show him how to get through this in the best way. I did not want him to suffer from this. As you said, I wanted him to expand and to heal and to grow out of this. But in order for him to do that, I was going to have to do it.
Yeah. It makes me, this idea of post-traumatic growth makes me think of Viktor Frankl in some ways, who might be considered maybe the grandfather of this idea of finding meaning in suffering. Mm-hmm. He famously wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that we find purpose in three distinct places: in our relationships, in our work, in our creativity, and in our suffering. And he quotes, I believe, Dostoevsky in that book with this small quote, "Are we worthy of our suffering?" Which is so poignant. And you may be familiar with this woman, Candace Lightner, who founded MAD. It's Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Absolutely.
Her daughter was killed by an inebriated driver. And in response, you know, she had a period of grief, but she found meaning in that grief and founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And so I wonder, at what point were you able to find meaning in the wake of Jesse's death?
Yeah, you know, you do not want your child to die in vain. And I knew that his message of nurturing, healing, love was going to be the meaning that he left behind. It was almost like a spiritual awareness that he had, that he wasn't going to be on earth for very much longer. But it was also a directive for me. I knew that I would be spending the rest of my life spreading that message. And I feel like he gave me the platform, you know, everybody that I meet, anywhere that I go, has heard about the tragedy at Sandy Hook. So I feel like that is the platform. And then his message provides the meaning for it. And the amazing thing is that his message of nurturing, healing, love has now gone around the world. It's being taught in over 10,000 schools in every state and 150 countries. So through his murder, now kids are learning a powerful formula to enable them to thoughtfully respond to anything that happens in their life with love. You know, you mentioned Viktor Frankl, and one of my favorite quotes of Viktor Frankl's is when he says, in between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and freedom. And that is one of the foundational aspects of what I'm doing now and the Choose Love movement is providing a way for kids and adults to be able to thoughtfully respond to whatever happens in their life by taking their personal power back and choosing love. Because the bottom line is this: we can't always choose what happens to us. And I am the poster child for that. I would never have chosen to have my son murdered. And by the way, none of us would have chosen a global pandemic, but we can all take our personal power back in how we choose to respond.
Right. I want to hover just on grief just for one more moment, because I think many people could feel like their own grief is so trivial relative to yours. But you actually met some young people from Rwanda that had endured just unspeakable tragedy. And I wonder if you could speak to that a bit and how it impacted JT.
Wow, that was a pivotal moment for both JT and I. Following the shooting, JT didn't want to go back to school, understandably. He was in 7th grade, and I didn't want him to go back either. I was afraid for him to go back to school. The school did not have any plan. And we had during this kind of month period, we had a group of orphan genocide survivors reach out to us on Skype, reach out to JT specifically. So he's in his bedroom, he's got his screen open, and these two beautiful, now young adults came on the screen with an interpreter, and they explained to JT that they had heard about what happened to his little brother, and they were so sorry, and they wanted to share their story with him, and talk about how they moved through, how they grew through, how they learned from their own personal tragedy, how they were strengthened by it. And they talked about how when they were 4 years old, they had been in the Rwandan genocide, where over 1 million Tutsis were murdered by their neighboring Hutus within 90 days. And they had literally watched their families, their parents, their brothers and sisters, their neighbors, their aunts and uncles being murdered in cold blood, attempted murder on them. They had scars on their face. And then the journey afterwards of living in Red Cross camps and having to go through learning about forgiveness and reconciliation and trying to implement that in their own life, going back into the same community as the people that had murdered their families and having to live alongside them. I mean, they were talking to JT. I was standing behind them thinking, these people have suffered far worse than we have. And I think for both JT and I, it was such an incredible example of what we could do in our own lives. And I know that afterwards, JT said that he wanted to go back to school. And I said, really? Like, why? And he said, well, because, if those kids could do what they do, I know that I can, and I actually want to turn around and I want to help them. They had talked about how, they had no resources to go to school, and they shared a little bit about their lives. And so JT literally went back to school and he started raising money for those same kids so that they could go to school and they could continue to spread their message the way that they were doing. And that act of compassion in action was such a huge part of JT's healing, when he literally went back to school so that he could start fundraising. He created these bracelets, and he created an organization called newtownhelpsrwanda.org. I think it's still up, and he started raising money. And this is all facilitated through the tapping solution, which was amazing, because the tapping solution was over there in Rwanda helping these kids. And so they kind of helped in the background facilitate this exchange. And it was such an incredible lesson for me, and not one that we're usually taught, and kind of one that is counterintuitive to the way that some of us live our lives, which is, the more I give, the more I get. If I do something for someone else, that actually heals me. It's a little counterintuitive, but it was incredible, the transformation that JT went through. And I learned a lot from it.
Wow, that is simply incredible. I mean,
you know
must
what?
Just be so proud of him.
I was so proud of him, and he actually raised enough money, continued raising money, and sent 2 orphan genocide survivors to university. One got their MBA, one went to 4 years of college, and then he kept going because it made him feel good. It strengthened him. It continued to heal him, because healing, of course, is a lifelong journey. So then we met a woman, Jane Ikaro, who runs an organization in Uganda that helps children who were former children's soldiers. And he raised money for them, and he built a self-sustaining fish pond for them. And then he built self-sustaining poultry operations for the kids so that they could make money and eat. He keeps going. And for me, it's an incredibly huge lesson, and one that I modeled my own recovery off of, which is the more you do for others, the more that you're doing for yourself. The more you help others heal, the more you heal. And I think that is such an incredible lesson that I've learned that I did not know before.
Yeah, that is so poignant. This idea that compassion, bringing loving kindness to the presence of suffering in a way that specifically intends to alleviate that suffering, that also alleviates your own suffering. I mean, that is just a huge epiphany to have. And the same with forgiveness. I mean, and I'd love to talk with you about forgiveness, because it is often conceived as a gift that you give someone else. But in many ways, it can be a gift that you give yourself. And that's what I'd love to probe with you a little bit. I mean, forgiveness is often referred to as the hardest virtue to actually enact. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of forgiveness and how you came to forgive Mr. Lanza.
I learned so much about forgiveness, and I realized I knew nothing about it before. I mean, it's in my belief that you forgive so that you're forgiven. And that's all that I knew. And, and wow, did I really go deep, and mainly because of this, because I did not want to spend the rest of my life angry. And I saw so many people that were shackled in anger. And I didn't want that for myself. I didn't want to give my personal power away to a young man that was clearly so troubled. And I didn't want that for JT either. So I started exploring this concept of forgiveness. And the other thing is that even from the very beginning, and it may sound incredible, but I felt a lot of compassion for the shooter himself. I watched how other people reacted, and I saw all of the blame being focused on the shooter and his mother. And the interesting thing about that was that she was a single mom taking care of a special needs son. And the interesting thing about that is that when JT was young, he and I went through some really difficult times. And when I went to the school when he was young, I asked them for help. And JT needed help, and we were refused. And it was interesting because Adam Lanza and his mom went through the same exact process. So I had compassion for her. I knew that she had tried the best that she could with the skills and tools that she had. By the way, I didn't have very good skills and tools either before I learned them after Jesse's murder and going through the process of creating the Choose Love movement. But I knew that it couldn't be all their fault. I knew that that was way too easy. I knew that if it was, then it would never have happened before. But wait a minute, we've had lots of school shootings before, and it would never have happened again. But wait a minute, we've had over 350 school shootings since Sandy Hook Elementary School. We had over 50 last year alone. That's not Adam Lanza's fault and his mother's. And so it really made me think, whose fault is it? If we have to blame somebody, whose fault is it? And I saw no one taking responsibility. Absolutely zero. Trying to find responsibility or even anybody being held accountable. And so I thought, well, this happened in my community, in my school district. So I guess I will have to take my part of the responsibility for living here and for having it happen here. And I was hoping by doing that, that other people would start to take responsibility for what's going on in our world, in your universe, whatever that is, wherever that is, take responsibility for that so that you can be part of the solution.
Yeah.
And so, that's part, it was the path to forgiveness, didn't start with anger for me. It did start with compassion. But it was interesting, the conversations that I had, the arguments. My father and I didn't speak for 3 months because we disagreed on the definition of forgiveness, which sounds ridiculous when I say it, but it's true. I felt like forgiveness did not preclude holding people responsible for their actions. And he said, no, forgiveness is letting it go. You just let it go. You can't hold people accountable. And I said, well, I don't understand, because if I was raped, it would be my responsibility to hold my rapist accountable so that he didn't do it to other people. So anyway, that was the disconnect there. But I learned so much about forgiveness. I learned that it was a gift that I gave myself. I learned that it really had nothing to do with the other person. I learned that it was the only way that I could take my personal power back and cut that cord that attached me to pain. And so I talk about a lot. In fact, one of the main focuses of the Choose Love movement is on forgiveness, because lo and behold, there are decades of research that talk about the benefits of forgiveness to the forgiver, and ultimately how it enhances our relationships, and the depth of our connections are what lead us to happiness. So you see how this is really important in your own personal journey to be able to understand this and then practice it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many lessons in there, Scarlett. I look at my own subjective experience of the world, And, when I'm angry, I'm the one that's angry. I'm the one that's suffering from holding an ember in my hand, waiting for the right moment to vengefully throw it at someone. But all that time, I'm the one getting burned. And so, this I think is another great epiphany that one can have, is that the overcoming of resentment and vengeance is such a relief for yourself. And it allows you to step into this better part of yourself, as difficult as it might be. And this is actually really one thing that I've been wanting to ask you. So I interviewed this guy named Dr. Robert Enright a few years ago. He is one of the world's biggest aficionados at the University of Wisconsin on the nature of forgiveness. And I wonder if this held true with you. He said, first, this was a generalization, so this isn't always true, but he said, first, you forgive with your head, and then your heart follows. Was that the process for you?
I love that. I'm not sure that was the process for me, because I felt compassion for Adam and his mom from the beginning, and that comes from the heart. But I will tell you the process that I went through in my head, and that was that I was not going to allow a troubled young man who was suicidal, then homicidal, and who had created such horrific havoc. I was not going to let someone like that have control over my thoughts that impact how I feel, that then impacts my behavior and how I show up in relationships. I was never going to allow him, and he was dead, by the way, to have any amount of control over my life. But the only way that I could take that personal power back was through forgiveness. And so that is how my head dealt with that. So it is a head-heart thing. I completely agree with Dr. Enright, and I love his work.
Yeah, he's a lovely and brilliant guy. Very soft-spoken and unassuming, sweet guy. I wonder if forgiveness is an ongoing process, or if it's sort of like you cross a threshold of forgiveness and then you have forgiven and you no longer need to forgive and that process is done, or do you wake up on certain days and have to forgive again?
That's a really good question. And for the past 9 years, I have said that it starts with a choice and then it becomes a process. And I say that, I wake up on Jesse's birthday, on the anniversary 12/14 that just passed, on Mother's Day, on my birthday, on Christmas, Valentine's Day, so many different days that you get up and you feel sadness. But I think, just now having this conversation with you, I think that if you forgive with your heart as well as with your head, if you forgive to the point where you can feel compassion, and there's a great quote by someone who said that that if you knew everyone from their birth until now, if you knew everything that happened to them during their whole entire life, you would feel nothing but love and compassion for them. And that certainly was the case for Adam Lanza. Learning about his life, and people are sometimes horrified that I talk with compassion about him. But, there are only a few stories that I need to tell, and people understand where I'm coming from. He was bullied and isolated and most likely sexually abused by a trusted adult. He went to first grade in Sandy Hook Elementary School. It's how he knew where to go to perpetrate the crime. And he had a backpack filled with birthday invitations for his 6th birthday. And he passed them out to all of his classmates. No one came. There are stories like that. He wrote a story about a witch when he was in 5th grade that came to Sandy Hook Elementary School with a broomstick. The broomstick opened into a semi-automatic weapon and she murdered children. He wrote this story and he made copies, and it was his intention to bring it to the school to sell. It was taken, but no action was given. I mean, that was his way of trying to say, this is in my head. Help me. We have this ideal that kids are going to sit there and go, I'm having thoughts of self-harm and harming others. Can you please make sure that I get help? It's just not the way that it works. And so, he's crying out for help and he's not getting it. So you can see why he got angry. And I hope that this helps, those listening to understand a little bit more why I felt compassion. And so I think that it's less when you do feel, when you really work on your forgiveness, and it can start with your heart or your head. But I think when those two align, then the need to continuously go through that process is lessened.
Yeah, I was unaware of some of those stories that you related about Adam Lanza. I knew that he was diagnosed with Asperger's, I believe, which really kind of disables one's ability to socially interact and communicate. I knew that he was depressive and a relatively pretty much a shut-in. I don't think he ever really left his room, and I believe he was anorexic at the time of the massacre. I believe he was like 6 feet tall and 112 pounds. So I'm 6 feet tall and 169 pounds on a good day. One could only imagine how miserable and depressed and depraved this human being was. And of course, he ended his own life to kind of bookend. Usually
the kids that are homicidal are suicidal before then. And of course, the fact that he had Asperger's has no bearing on anything that happened on that day. But I did meet with the former president of Autism Speaks, and he wanted to hear about what I was doing. And so I explained to him the programming and the formula for choosing love, which we will get into. And he said, wow, he said, he had a son with autism. And he said, so I'm wondering, while you're teaching your lessons in the classroom, if he would have been able to understand them and to take them in and get as much out of them as the other kids. And I said, that's a great question. And I don't know the exact answer to that. However, I do know that all the other kids would have been able to take in the lessons on compassion and forgiveness and gratitude and courage, and they would have been different. They would have treated Adam differently. So I think that, it's definitely something that was 100% preventable. And as are the vast majority of school shootings. I mean, any school shooting I've ever heard about or looked at was preventable as well. And we're going to have to change the way that we look at these issues in order to prevent them. I mean, up until now, we've been reacting and we've been focusing on the attack end of the pathway to violence. We've been hardening schools and subjecting our kids to active shooter drills and things like that. And I'm not making a judgment on that. But what I am saying is clearly that's not enough because they continue on a regular basis. And what we are realizing, others are realizing is that really the most important part of school safety is the other end of the scale, which is the culture end of the scale, the school culture, because school cultures that are connected, that are compassionate and loving, they can reduce and prevent a grievance from even happening. And it's the grievance that usually extends into the attack. Or if a grievance does happen, because they do, when kids have these what are called essential life skills, the ability to get along with each other, to have relationships, to have meaningful connections, to be able to manage their emotions, to be able to face and grow through difficulty, to make responsible decisions, then they're able to reduce and precede a grievance or even manage a grievance before it escalates into an attack. So really, really an important, essential part of school safety.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up, because our society seems keen to always water the leaves and not the roots, and not always address root causes. And of course, you can make metaphors with our sick care industry, where people get diabetic and we just throw a drug at it, or people have heart disease and we just prescribe a statin, instead of actually addressing underlying causes of what is causing the inflammation in a physiological system. Well, maybe we need to address diet, maybe we need to address sleep or stress. Well, this is similar in a way, because what you're really doing is addressing the root causes before they become a problem. And I do have deep concerns right now. I was mentioning just before we got on, I read an article, a very extensive article in the New York Times yesterday about the prevalence of depression and mental illness among children, specifically connected to this moment. I have 3 daughters, and they have been almost exclusively learning at home. Now, thank God they have each other, and we have high-speed internet, so they're continuing to learn. But the huge amount of people don't have that luxury, and kids are becoming increasingly isolated. And when they're isolated, they don't have support structures. They don't develop social skills. They're often fall prey to the kind of thinner edges of the internet, which can radicalize kids and pull them into kind of untoward circumstances. So I wonder if you could address a little bit about the prevalence of childhood depression and how the Choose Love movement is going about addressing this issue, and talk a little bit about your curriculum and how you offer it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really kind of an unprecedented time in our history, and our kids are suffering tremendously. And I think that the majority of everything that you're talking about starts with anxiety. And it's interesting because anxiety was a pandemic. If you go with the definition of what a pandemic is before the pandemic, and the average onset age for anxiety in our society is 6 years old. These are pre-pandemic numbers. We know that over 70% of kids did not get professional help, so they suffered alone. And all of the stuff that we're seeing now can be considered the outcomes of untreated anxiety. And so anxiety is what leads to depression and all of the other things that we're seeing here, unfortunately. And there's a lot to be anxious about, really, frankly. And so what the Choose Love movement does is it teaches essential life skills to be able to manage that anxiety, manage your emotions. And so we actually teach a powerful formula for being able to thoughtfully respond to any situation with love. And so that formula starts with courage, For the older kids, we actually give Jesse's example of courage, where he stood up to the shooter and saved 9 of his classmates' lives. Kind of the ultimate example of courage, but then with the lesson that we all have that capacity for courage, that science tells us that courage is like a muscle, that we can practice it to strengthen it. And certainly, regardless of whether you're a child or you're an adult, living in today's world and facing what we have to face takes a lot of courage. And courage is the most important character value because it's the one that underlies all the rest. So we literally start right there by teaching self-awareness, by teaching kids to check in with themselves so they know what is going on with themselves, having the courage to look at that and to say, hey, I am feeling anxious. I'm not feeling well. And to understand that that needs to be addressed and to be able to have the courage to face it and not resist and avoid it. And so, really, really important to start there. And then we move into gratitude, teaching about gratitude, how we go into a lot of thinking about what we're thinking about. So our thoughts, and we all have tens of thousands of thoughts every day, the majority of which are negative and repetitive because of that negative bias that I referred to. This includes our kids too. And when we start thinking about what we think about and say we're in a fearful, anxious, resentful, frustrated space, we can shift the focus of our lens away from that if we want to, if we're ready, if it's appropriate, by using gratitude. So gratitude literally can provide relief. We can only focus on one thought at a time. How would you know this unless you were told this? And so you can use a practice of gratitude to shift the focus of your lens away from those fearful thoughts to more grateful thoughts. And there's always something to be grateful for. Of course, it would take courage to be grateful, to do that practice when things aren't going your way, but you already have this baseline of courage. And then we move into forgiveness, and it can be forgiveness for yourself that can't be overlooked. Forgiveness for a myriad of things, of being fearful, of then being isolated and then not wanting to go out and see people. So many things that we're dealing with now. Forgiving others for misunderstandings, and so important. And literally the way to take your personal power back. By forgiving, and all the things that, we've talked about forgiveness quite a bit during this podcast, but so important to learn the gifts that forgiveness gives yourself. And we focus on the benefits for us. It's kind of like, I'm in my room, I'm not feeling well. If you're a child or an adult, why should I do this? Why should I focus my time on this when I could just go on and watch Netflix? And so we do focus on the benefits. This is what this practice will do for you. I mean, forgiveness has a myriad decades of research about the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of forgiving. They're amazing. And by the way, it increases and strengthens your immune system. It's the way to have healthy relationships and connections. And there's just to feel good. And so you learn the benefits of that. And then we go into the compassion in action, which we talked about with JT's example. That is having the courage to step outside of your fear, your own suffering, your own pain, even your own busyness and distraction to help other people. And then the understanding that all of the nurturing, healing love that you give out, you get back. And so that is this formula for choosing love and teaching kids that. I mean, I've literally, we have a school-based program. We have a program for parents that correlates to what we're teaching with the kids. So everyone can be on the same page. And then we also have a community program. And literally this past year, having been in schools and seeing really what is going on with our youth, I literally took a bus and wrapped it in the formula for choosing love. And I've taken this out onto the road, and I'm literally bringing it to people, to schools, to government agencies, to police departments, to prisons, to give them an experiential experience so they can literally feel the power of practicing these things. That we do brave breaths, and we do brave poses, and talk about how that can help strengthen our courage. We write gratitude letters, and we think about how it makes us feel and how it makes the other person feel. We literally write on a piece of paper an experience that hurt us, that someone else did, or that we did to hurt someone else. We write it down, or even the little kids draw it. And oh my gosh, it is incredible to have elementary school kids, really, really young kids. They know exactly what this practice is. They're walking around with so much hurt, so much pain. And it was, I had to keep reminding myself as these kids were releasing all of this pain onto the paper, that I was giving them a valve to be able to release this. So much hurt. For instance, there was a first grader that this little girl who wrote, "I am so sorry, SORE, for FORE, everything I done. So sorry." And you just think, oh my God, what could this 6-year-old, beautiful little girl have done that she could be carrying around so much shame and blame and guilt? And so, watching these kids with all of this pain, putting it onto paper, and then saying, okay, what are you going to do with that hurt? What are you going to do with that pain and discomfort? And what they did was they would crumple it up, and then they would throw it away in either a bin, for a garbage bin for self or others. So if you're forgiving yourself or you're forgiving others. One time I came over, and there was this little boy who was ripping up this paper. He was literally sweating and all red. He was so angry. And this was like maybe a first or second grader, ripping it up. I don't know what he wrote, so angry. And I said, well, what are you going to do with that pain? And he walked over and he slam dunked it into the garbage can labeled other. And he's walking away. And I said, does that feel good? And he taught me something. He turned around and he looked at me and he said, better. It feels better. So at least we have something that can enable us to feel better. And then the compassion in action table, we have done things like having the kids create bags for the homeless, pack bags, literally for the homeless, to tie quilts for the homeless, to draw little wooden coins to be able to give to somebody to brighten their day. And the whole experience is a way for them to feel what it feels like, to empower them to know that there are things that they can do to feel better, even at their lowest.
That's so beautiful. And this is the kind of curriculum that children aren't getting. And I don't mean to demean mathematics or geography or science, but these are the life skills that actually are central to happiness and well-being. And they're just not generally part of the curriculum. But these
they're
are
not. In fact,
absolutely.
I was going to say,
Yeah, go ahead.
when I found out about this type of learning, I went to the curriculum director at Sandy Hook and I said, "Oh my gosh, this would have prevented the shooting. And have you ever heard of it?" And she said, "Yeah, of course." I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, it was just too expensive. We had purchased a program, but we couldn't afford to train the teachers." That, by the way, is why all of my programming is no cost. So important. And then I thought, well, I'm going to create this and it will be to fill the gaps, because this is so important. Obviously, schools are doing it. They know this. And the fact of the matter, and what I learned, was that less than 10% of US schools were prioritizing this. And the interesting thing is, there are decades of research that show when kids have these lessons, this understanding, they get better grades and test scores, higher attendance, higher graduation rates, less stress and anxiety, less emotional mental issues. And that lasts. So they've taken kids that have this all the way into adulthood. And these now young adults have less substance abuse, less mental illness, less incarceration, even less divorce rates. So this is really, really powerful stuff. And it's not hard to teach, but it does have to be prioritized. And here's the thing I think that's going on with schools. I mean, I think that what we don't understand about all of this is that it is a practice that we do for the rest of our lives. It's not just really learning this lesson and then, taking a program off a shelf and teaching it and then putting it back on the shelf and doing the math or the reading or the writing. It's literally something that has to be infused in everything that you do all day long. It is a practice that you do for the rest of your life. And yes, it takes effort, but the payoffs are long lasting, and they result in flourishing. They result in being the best you.
And all of this kind of curriculum falls under the aegis of social emotional learning. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting because there are programs that are called social and emotional learning. There are positive psychology programs. There are character education programs. There are mindfulness programs. And I took really the best of these ideologies, and I put them into one program. And I included all on a base of being trauma informed, because our kids have so much trauma, as well as post-traumatic growth, teaching the awareness that there is this thing called post-traumatic growth, that really, when we go through difficulty in our lives, it literally is an opportunity to learn from, grow through, and be strengthened by whatever difficulty is. It is an opportunity for growth. And then to take that one step further, to be able to take what we've learned, that wisdom, and use it to help other people. So this is everything in one program, and it is no cost, because I know that this would have saved my son's life, and I know that it can reduce and prevent so much of the suffering that we're experiencing in our world. And that includes, by the way, a lot of the substance abuse and mental illness that we're seeing as well. A lot of that can be reduced and prevented by having these essential life skills.
Yeah, and I want to just pull on a thread that you brought up briefly, where you said that forgiveness can also improve your immune system, because there are physiological benefits to courage, gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, as well as psychological, mental, and spiritual ones. Where, and this I think is poignant and prescient for today, because the world is experiencing tremendous amount of fear. Mm-hmm. And our children are incredibly susceptible to fear. And there are certain negative emotions like fear and like rage and anger that are centered in a particular part of our brain that is known as the amygdala. that is concomitant with certain neurotransmitters like cortisol and adrenaline and epinephrine that were very, very useful when we were living on the Serengeti and might be attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, but not as useful when we're trying to work cooperatively with other people. And if your physiology is constantly in a state of what is called the sympathetic nervous system, where it is in chronic cortisol infusion, you are going to have chronic anxiety, you are going to have inflammation in your body, you're going to have dysbiosis in your gut, but you're also going to not be able to properly rationalize and reason around certain kinds of issues. And so the practice of compassion and forgiveness can actually pull us back into our prefrontal cortex, where we can actually refine discernment and our ability to reason. And I think that that is incredibly important in this era of fear. And, obviously we live in a particular moment that is awash with conspiracy theory, and I support healthy skepticism. But of course, some of these conspiracy theories, I'm sure that you've experienced firsthand. Most notably, like Alex Jones, who's an alt-right commentator who claimed that Sandy Hook was a false flag event for years. And thankfully, he's been found guilty of defamation recently. But it brings up a couple of questions that I would have for you. Is like, how were you actually able to cope with your loss while also dealing with people that lacked discernment and were claiming that Sandy Hook was a hoax? And I guess I would say, as a follow-on to that, in this world that is awash with fallacious claims and conspiracy theories, do you have any advice for people about how to actually stay grounded and delineate fact from fiction?
That's a really great question. From day one, we had those who were saying that Sandy Hook was a hoax from day one, and that was Alex Jones. And then he is funding and promoting other people, literally, that were having contact with us, accusing us of being CIA agents and actors and wanting to take people's guns away. And it was scary, honestly, because you are at your weakest point, and having gone through such a tremendous loss, and then you have this onslaught of people accusing you of heinous things unjustly, and to the point where it's just it doesn't even make sense. And I am also a fan of healthy skepticism, but we have to accept the truth that things like this are happening, and I feel like Alex Jones, when he denies. And by the way, there was a survey in 2018 that I think said that almost a quarter of Americans doubt the fact that Sandy Hook happened, which is just incredibly disappointing to me, because here's the problem. If we don't acknowledge the truth, then we can't fix the problem. So, in my world, you're either a part of the solution or you're a part of the problem. And with Alex Jones, continuing, and to this day, he continues to say that it didn't happen. He is actually part part of the problem, part of the, continuing the fact that our kids aren't safe. He is perpetuating that problem. And that's, really disgusting to me. I think that it's important to question things, to think for ourselves. Unfortunately, all of the time that we spend on our screens lowers our ability to critically think. And I think that that is a big problem. For the first time ever, we have global information 24/7 being pushed to us. We're designed to go out and forage for information. Now we have it at our fingertips. And I think that we have to really, really be self-aware. That's the self-awareness is a social and emotional skill. And it's probably the most important one, because you really have to know yourself. You have to understand where your limits and boundaries are, and what your truth is, and what the truth is, and stick with that and not be led by fear. I think that that is probably the biggest issue here, is that there are people that are so fearful and they don't want to believe, perhaps they do not have the capacity to accept that 26 people could be massacred in an elementary school in America. It does sound it sounds impossible, doesn't it? But yet it's happened over 350 times since Sandy Hook. So unless we face the truth, face reality, that takes courage. It really does. For me too. Face reality and accept it. And then further take responsibility for what's going on in our world, and be part of the solution. Do something. Don't just acknowledge it. Do something. Even if it's something small, it doesn't matter. Everything that everyone does works towards a solution and changes the energy. And so if that is something that we need to do, is really work on our own courage to face this fear mongering that is going around, because you can be led by fear. And when you are not making your own decisions. You are not critically thinking for yourself. You're not being your authentic self. And so I think that, the first thing that your listeners can do is really just sit with yourself and think about what you're thinking about, and list your fears on a piece of paper and see which ones are even real, because we know the majority of what we fear every day doesn't happen. Yes, there's this huge fear of I guess ultimately death. Yet there's a great quote: what we fear, what is it? What we fear yesterday, what we fear today was what we feared yesterday, which is what we'll fear tomorrow. In other words, really take stock of your fears and then work to increase your courage so that you can face them and not be led by them.
Yeah, that's great advice. I wonder where you are in terms of your journey of post-traumatic growth right now in your life.
I have grown so incredibly much over the last 9 years. In fact, when people say, even during the pandemic, I just wish we could get back to normal. I think we don't want to go back to normal. We want to learn from this and grow through this. We want to be better off because of this. And that is a possibility, but it does mean that we have to find courage in order to face it and move through it. In my own journey, I am voracious in my learning. I am constantly reading. And I mean, now more than ever, there are podcasts like yours and videos available online. You can purchase a book and have it delivered to your door the next day. I am constantly learning and growing. And I believe that's why we're here on earth. I do not want to have regrets in my life. And I can tell you that living in the present moment, being present with the ones that you love, not on this, but literally being present and interacting with the ones that you love, facing your fear, because everyone has fears, and growing through them, learning from them, your fears and your pain will take you to the next level, will help you continue to grow. And I believe that's why we're here.
That's beautiful, Scarlett. I think your 4 pillars of the Choose Love movement really say it all. And I've been very drawn to a Hellenistic philosophy recently known as Stoicism. And they also have 4 pillars, which are somewhat similar. They're courage, moderation or self-control, and justice and wisdom. And all of those virtues are very, very interconnected. So it's like when you have the courage to merge moderation and justice, that begets wisdom. And that's a bit of an aphorism, I know, but when you were talking about all of those pillars and how one is almost necessary for the other, this is really what scaffolds a full and flourishing life. And when I think about courage, Brené Brown obviously speaks incredibly eloquently about it, but courage has almost become synonymous with vulnerability. But also, what am I willing to sacrifice for the greater good? And that courage isn't necessarily reckless. It's not just running into the front lines. It's often portrayed as kind of on the battlefield, but courage actually marries a certain amount of discernment and wisdom and finds that balance between fear and recklessness. And then I think about gratitude. And this one for me, when you were talking, I was trying to feel what landed. And I'll just summarize it this way. Gratitude for me is loving what I already have. And I think for a lot of us, there is another famous quote that comparison is the thief of happiness, right? So that we think of happiness as something that's always out there that we're chasing. And then as soon as we achieve or obtain that particular thing or that award or that ego adulation, there's a new shiny bright object on the horizon that we're immediately already chasing. And this is what is known as the hedonic treadmill. And we're never grateful for what we actually have right here until sometimes we lose it. And so there is a Stoic practice about thinking about losing something that you treasure and then waking up to the fact that you already have it. And that That's can beautiful. Bring you into a state of gratitude. It's really lovely. Yeah. It sounds morose at the beginning, but it's lovely. And then, forgiveness, obviously we've mined that considerably. But the lesson for me is that it just doesn't forsake justice and accountability. When you said that, that really landed. It was like you can forgive and still hold accountable. And that was, I think, the lodestone moment for me when you said that. And then compassion, the agency that compassion has, that separates it from empathy on some level. And they're both can be wonderful traits and virtues. But empathy, you can don the emotional clothing of someone else, but that could have a positive valence or a negative valence. But there's no agency required. But compassion is this bringing of loving kindness to the presence of suffering in a way that actively alleviates it. And so there's so much agency in that. And that agency turns around on yourself. And so those were the lessons I took from listening to you speak so beautifully about it. And the fact that you woven those up into this tapestry of Choose Love is, it feels like exactly what we need, always, but right now. And, boy, am I grateful that you're bringing those teachings to the world.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. And that is a really important distinction between empathy and compassion. I'm reading a lot of articles that talk about compassion burnout in the healthcare system and in education. And in reality, there is no such thing as compassion burnout when you really truly understand the definition of compassion. But there is empathy burnout, because empathy lights up the same receptors in your brain as physical pain. So you can have empathy burnout, but I think it's such an important distinction to understand that when you practice compassion, compassion is the identification of a need and then the action to help solve that need or to alleviate the suffering. That actually strengthens you. It actually gives you energy. So I think that that's such an important awareness for people to know, especially those that are out on the front lines dealing with this coronavirus every single day, that the more you give, and we've talked about this before, the more you can receive.
Yeah, and not enough attention, I think, gets spent in gratitude for a lot of those folks right now. I think, obviously there's a lot of reason to be frustrated, and there's a lot of, miscommunication that's going on. But still, I try to remind myself every day of the folks that have really given the most. And the folks, all the healthcare workers and nurses and people in the ICU that have been really just putting it all on the line for almost 2 years. It's just, we owe them such a great debt.
It's incredible. There are modern day superheroes, that those people, as well as our educators, that continue to show up in however they can and do the best that they can. Definitely modern day superheroes.
Yeah. And just like grief, there was no training for this. I look at my kids' teachers. They didn't have training for a pandemic. And, some of them have resources and some of them don't, but they're literally improvising on the spot, trying to hold this responsibility. And you're absolutely right. They are superheroes. So if we can have a moment of gratitude for all of our superheroes today, that would be a great service.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this interview from the Commune podcast, then I think you'll love this video right here.
That's what it looks like. I've betrayed. I've been betrayed. I've broken up with people. They've broken up with me. People have died. My sons died. My parents. It's hideous. And no matter what...